when I'm having fights with my husband, sometimes, it doesn't feel so good to walk out of the room. But I find that I can get this kind of distance by doing something peculiar, like lying down on the floor and staring at the ceiling and feeling myself breathe. And then I can get a few empathy guesses out. So you'd really like to be heard. And it interrupts the visual, and it also interrupts the physical pattern of conflict, which at that point, he's usually over here going, so any empathy guesses at all are really good at that point. Yeah.
By you or by him?
Either of us. Yeah.
What's an empathy guess?
An empathy guess in nonviolent communication is some combination of an emotion and a longing. Yes. Do you need to be known for? Would you love it if? Do you need me to understand how deeply you care about? Is there an ache for connection? Are you terrified, and do you need acknowledgement of how great the terror is? It's kind of a formulation. Thank you for asking. It's kind of jargony, but very good to get some sort of feeling word and some sort of need word. If we're having conflict in more formal environments where we don't get to lie down, then we can just name the values instead of going into the feelings. Because often, like in workplace situations or the grocery store, it's too intimate. If we say, "Are you angry?" we can just say, "Are you just so wanting predictability?" We can just go for the deep longing that's underlying things instead of the particulars of the emotional content. So we're respecting social mores to some extent and pushing the boundaries where we can. I love Dominic Barter's definition of conflict. Conflict is new information entering a system. My definition takes off from that. I see it as conflict is resistance to new information. Entering a system. And we will come back to this after we learn a little bit about the hemispheres, because when we learn about the hemispheres, this differentiation begins to make a little more sense. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get you involved in being hemispheric neurons, just for a moment. So to start, what I'd like to have, so if this is Sarah's brain taken out and plopped onto the ground, and the left hemisphere is here and the right hemisphere is here, I need about 8 left hemisphere neurons and about 8 right hemisphere neurons. Please come and be neurons for me. And the left hemisphere neurons get to arrange themselves a bit like soldiers or an orchard, whichever you prefer. If you don't, yes. So if you orient yourselves so that this is the front. Yeah, no, we need more. And you get to just mill around and be connected here. Okay, so now what we have is we have the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is in rows and columns. And indeed, inside of the brain, the left hemisphere is more organized than the right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere of the brain the neurons have short little arms, a little like Tyrannosaurus Rex. Please do your Tyrannosaurus Rex arms. And these are the bytes of information that the left hemisphere can take into account. So the left hemisphere neurons, yes, you have a child. Yes, it's the Tyrannosaurus Rex claws. Okay, so now what happens in the left hemisphere is that when thoughts want to travel, they have to travel from neuron to neuron. So this is a thought bubble. Each pen is a thought bubble. Go ahead and think left hemisphere. You can have two thoughts at once. But then you pass them on. Yes. Yes. Keep passing. Yes. Here's the left hemisphere at work. The left hemisphere at work, yeah, see how they're very focused, one from the other. Yes, they're driven, they can only handle so much information at a time, right? Then, in contrast, we have the right hemisphere, where they are just flowing. They don't actually move around, but they have long arms, so they can reach all the way across one another, and they can share information easily, big picture ideas, a sense of the whole. There's no problem with complexity. There's no problem with infinity. And these guys over here are like, okay, what do I do next? What's my next step? Yes. So can you see how different these two are? The hemispheres are different in their neuronal structure. They're different in the neurochemicals that they run on. The left hemisphere runs on dopamine. The right hemisphere loves discovery. It loves surprise. It runs on adrenaline, interestingly enough. Even for the little things, it just loves to make sense of things and bring things together and have aha experiences and to apprehend one another's infinity. Now, here is the major problem. When we were doing the brain in the palm of the hand this morning, what was happening was we were working with this right hemisphere. So if the right hemisphere has not been structured with warmth and resonance, if the right hemisphere has not had an experience of making sense, then when we enter the right hemisphere is a place of hell and agony because it attacks the self. So go ahead and be cannibals on Sarah. Sarah goes into the right hemisphere. Here we go. And so Sarah goes, oh my God, I have to get out of here. And she pops over into the left hemisphere. Because the left hemisphere, although it is somewhat limited, is a safe place. Yes. Yes. So in this we see happening in conflict. Right? We go into a conflict situation, it's too much for us, we're overwhelmed not only by our own voices, but by the other person's voices as well. And so here we are being eaten alive by the right hemisphere, and then we go, oh my God, well, you know, we say, you're being just like your mother. We're retreating. And this is part of what conflict is always about. It's always about the movement from the unbearable right into the left. Because we need the right hemisphere to actually be able to integrate new information. This is where we integrate new information. We often have to mourn in order to integrate new information. If the right hemisphere is not a warmly structured place, we can't stay in it long enough to mourn. We have to pop out like water out of hot oil and come over here where this is the way the left hemisphere integrates new information. Blame. He did it. It's his fault. It's his fault. You know, it is his fault. It is not my fault. I didn't do anything. He's the one. And so we're here where there's blame. Blame is the only strategy that the left hemisphere has to integrate new information. So in order to be able to really move into and transform conflict from conflict to interdependence, we need this hemisphere, and we need this hemisphere to be a good place for us to live. We need it to be able to be kind to us. And when it's kind to us, we can do the work we need to do to be able to resolve all kinds of conflict, or to be with all kinds of conflict, to accept what it is that we don't want to accept. The biggest thing that brings couples into couples counseling or into NVC couples support is that they refuse to believe that the other person is traumatized and limited and paralyzed. Instead, they insist on the idea that the other person is doing it to them on purpose. Yes, it's their fault. Yes. And what we need is we need to be able to mourn that our partners are traumatized, or our community members are traumatized, and that trauma is affecting them in ways that give them less choice and less possibility. Okay, you're welcome to sit down. Thank you, my beloved neurons.
So it's the left that's attributing a story to an intention.
Yes, yes, yeah. The left is attributing an intention to the actions of others and holding them responsible for it. Yeah, yeah.
It's like a terrible cosmic joke.
It is. It's a terrible. The whole human brain. I deliberately put aside moments to mourn the human brain. Yes, in my weekly. Yes, Jenny.
Is it like the certainty and the sense making of the left brain that needs to do that?
Yes, the left hemisphere. Well, it wants to know who to blame.
Because it is certainty.
It is certainty, and it's and it allows the left hemisphere to at least get a sense of what's going on. Yeah. Because what happens with the hemispheres is that I think this is important. We'll do this, and Joe, will you be my model? Okay, so here I have my giant electromagnets, and I move them into place, and it takes out Joe's right hemisphere. Or I can do it over here. I can take out Joe's left hemisphere. Okay, so let's say I've taken out Joe's left hemisphere, and just her right hemisphere is on board. What this means now is that she actually still has an integrated body map. The information from the body comes up to the brain and is understood as a whole body only in the right hemisphere. So if I take my electromagnets and I take out her right hemisphere, then she's left with only the left hemisphere. With the left hemisphere, what she does is she can recognize the right half of her body. But she cannot even recognize the left half of the body because the brain, the hemispheres are cross-wired. So here she is, no left hemisphere. She's got the right half of her body. Whose arm is this? You say, my arm. My arm. And then you say, whose arm is this? She says, no idea. No idea. I don't know whose arm that is. And she says, it might belong to you. It's close to you. She can't feel it. So there's no feedback. It doesn't belong to her.
And that's from the left.
This is the left. Yeah. This is what the left does. The left can only recognize one side of the body. But here's how we know that the left hemisphere uses blame to integrate new information is Ramachandran is a neuroscientist who did this, and he said, whose arm is this? And the subject said, I have no idea. And then he said, you know, this arm is numb because Betsy was driving recklessly and she ran into you and there was a terrible car accident and you've lost the use of your left arm. And then all of a sudden, this research subject was able to say, that's my left arm. Because the research subject now has someone to blame.
Wow. But this researcher had a
Ramachandran.
brain damage?
No, he was actually using the I think he was using the electromagnets. Yeah. He might have been working with split hemisphere, because some of this research was done with folks who had their hemispheres split because of epilepsy, and they were able to discover some very interesting things from that. I can't remember which one he was doing. Yeah. So this is how we know that the left hemisphere is baffled without someone to blame. It doesn't know how to integrate even parts of the self without someone to blame if something has gone wrong. And another piece of this is that the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that's giving us feedback. It's the hemisphere that's bringing us information about course correction. So being able to course correct, to be able to correct the course that we're on. So, for example, I don't know how many people do this, but I do this. I can feel myself doing this. I'm driving, I lose my way, and I don't want to backtrack. I want to keep going in the direction that I'm going. I'll even go like a couple miles around out of my way. When you found the new route that was 12 minutes instead of 6 minutes, I'm like, go on the 12-minute route. We won't have to back up. You know, this is the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere doesn't know how to course correct, because course correcting would mean that you would have to mourn. Right? It means that you would have to say, oh my God, I took the wrong turn. The left hemisphere does not want to have taken a wrong turn. It never wants to have taken a wrong turn. It requires a right hemisphere to have the flexibility to be able to say, darn it, I went too far. I'm going to turn the car around. Yay, Carrie, flexible right hemisphere. Thank you very much, Joe. Yeah.
Is this related to an instinct of survival, because in this society, when somebody makes a mistake, it's punished?
And, well, indeed, and punishment comes from these guys. I mean, there are so many problems in our society that come from the dominance of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is not supposed to be dominant. It is supposed to be under the supportive care of a wired right hemisphere. Our lives are different. Our society would be different. Our living is different. Our connection to conflict is different if we have a well-wired right hemisphere, which is why we began today talking about the wiring of the right hemisphere. Our whole world is different if our right hemisphere is the one making the decisions. But we live in a world that is being dominated by left hemispheres. Punishment, blame, assigning responsibility, deciding who is wrong, punitive action.
Can I ask you a question? I think the right hemisphere is the locus for speech and language.
The left hemisphere is the locus for speech and language. The right hemisphere is the locus for understanding the nuances, the emotional nuances of speech and language. So the left hemisphere understands the content The right hemisphere understands prosody in language, everything that's not content. Gesture, tone. Oh, gesture is nonverbal. That's nonverbal. But prosody is tone, intonation, volume, emotion, rhythm, speed, aliveness. All of this is prosody. And that's what the right hemisphere is listening for. So again, if some of you may have heard this, some of you have heard this story before, but I love it for exactly illustrating this. My mother did not enjoy my body. My mother spent her entire life until the last few years telling me she did not enjoy my body by saying, Sarah, you are fat. So this was painful for me. And I spent the first years before I met nonviolent communication, I spent numbing out. I would actually be with her, and my husband would say to me, did you hear what your mother said to you? And I would say, no, I didn't hear that. Oh my God, did she say that again? It was like I went into a dissociated state when I was around her, because there was no way, right? There was no way for me to integrate. All I had was a left hemisphere. My right hemisphere was hell. And this is another coping strategy for having a right hemisphere that's hell, is not necessarily popping into the left hemisphere, but popping out of everything altogether. So I would pop out of everything altogether. I wouldn't even hear her. And then I was doing nonviolent communication, and I would hear her, and I would go to my friend, and I would say, that was hard. And my friend would say, hell yeah, of course that was hard. And I was being told I made sense for my experience. So this went on for maybe 5 years or 6 years. Most of what I worked on the first 5 or 6 years I was in nonviolent communication was my mother. So then one day, it was quite peculiar, she saw me and she said, you're fat. And I had had many, many people tell me that I made sense in the experience of this being difficult. And all of a sudden, it was like they were all there with me. And I was like, wow, I wonder what's happening here. So here is a shift from left hemisphere, content in language, to all of a sudden, my right hemisphere is on board. And I said to her, Mom, I wonder if when you see me, you just get so worried because you want me to have an easy time in the world and be loved and be respected. And she said, yes. And she didn't say anything about my weight for a year and a half. And I was like stunned. And then she did it again a year and a half later. And I did something similar, you know, some kind of empathy, some kind of guess about what was really happening for her when she was using these very difficult words. And for the rest of her life, she actually never mentioned my body again, which was extraordinary because it had been the main focus of her attention before then. So just so much worry, you know, that was all tucked into the right hemisphere expression that was coming out, you know, tragically through these words that were not helpful. So this, I think, is this starting to give you a sense of the difference between hearing people with the left hemisphere and hearing people with the right hemisphere?
Just wondering, does that make sense then? You know, the neuroanatomy of the left hemisphere is different in that sense.
Yes.
It's a different function.
Yes.
If it's a locus for content in language.
Exactly.
Is there a link there between that particular very highly specialized function of our left, of the human brain, with speech and language, and the kind of connection that might have to these very judgmental functions?
Yes, because if the only thing it's got is blame, then the only thing it's got, I mean, it can kind of try to pull itself back into neutrality. You've probably heard people do this. They really want to blame you, but they're trying to be neutral. You know, honey, I have an observation. I'm noticing that when you come home, you leave the cupboard doors open when you get your drink. You know, I mean, it's trying to be so careful, right? But it's still, you know, it makes your skin crawl sometimes. It's still so it's sort of this freight train, this momentum of wanting us to change, because really, we are the ones responsible